Mariam sat by the window of her modest cottage, the soft afternoon sun casting golden rays through the thin curtains. The village was peaceful, a serene place where time seemed to slow down. She could hear the distant chatter of children playing in the streets, the rustling of leaves from the old oak tree in her backyard, and the hum of bees as they flitted from flower to flower. All these sounds were familiar, comforting, part of the rhythm of life she had grown accustomed to. Her home was a haven of warmth and love. The walls were lined with family photographs, each one capturing a moment of happiness: her wedding day, the birth of her son, Imran, and the early years of his childhood. It was hard to believe that the little boy who once ran around the house with a toy truck was now grown, living in the city, far from her reach. But even as her body aged, her heart remained anchored to the memories of those days. Ahmed, her husband, sat in his favorite armchair beside her, the man she had loved for decades. His once strong, broad shoulders had become frail, his once dark hair now silvered with time. His health had been failing for some time, and it seemed like with every passing day, he became weaker. Yet, Mariam never complained. She had long since learned that love meant taking care of each other, through sickness and health, in every moment. She glanced over at him now. He was staring at the photograph of Imran on the mantelpiece, his face softening as memories of their son filled his heart. His eyes, once sharp and full of life, were now clouded with the fog of age and illness. "Mariam," Ahmed spoke slowly, his voice soft but firm, "I worry about you. What will happen when I'm gone?" Mariam felt a lump form in her throat. The idea of losing Ahmed was unbearable. He had been her rock, her companion in every way, and the thought of facing the world without him was something she had never allowed herself to entertain. But here he was, so vulnerable, so fragile. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. "Don't worry about me," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside. "I'll be fine. I have you. I have Imran. We're a family." Her words were meant to soothe him, but even as she spoke them, Mariam felt a flicker of doubt in her heart. Imran had been the joy of their lives, but he had grown distant. After marrying his wife, Samira, and settling in the city, he had begun to visit less and less. His calls became infrequent, and the long visits they once had were now reduced to short, rushed conversations. He had his own life now, one that didn't seem to have much room for his aging parents. The days stretched into months, and still, Imran did not come. Mariam wrote him letters, sent him photos of his father's deteriorating health, but the responses were few and far between. She couldn't help but feel abandoned. There was a time when she thought her son would always be by her side, that he would be there to take care of them as they grew older, just as she had taken care of him when he was young. But the cold truth was becoming clear. The bond between them was fraying. The once tight-knit family they had built was slowly unraveling. As the days went by, Mariam's worries deepened. She continued to care for Ahmed, now almost entirely bedridden, but the weight of her solitude was heavy. The visits from the neighbors, once frequent, were now sparse. People had their own lives to lead, and Mariam knew that her role in the village was becoming less central. She was just the old woman who lived in the cottage at the edge of town. It was on one of those lonely afternoons that Mariam's life changed forever. She had just returned from the market, her arms laden with groceries, when she saw a letter waiting for her on the doorstep. It was from Imran. Her heart raced as she opened the envelope, the familiar handwriting on the front bringing back memories of when he was a boy, eagerly sending her letters, filled with his excitement about life. But this letter was different. "Dear Mother," it began, "I hope this finds you well. I'm writing to inform you that I've sold the family property and am no longer able to help with any financial matters regarding the house. Samira and I have decided to move to a new place, and we are not planning to visit for the foreseeable future. I hope you understand. Take care." The words hit Mariam like a blow to the chest. She read them over and over, trying to make sense of them. Imran had sold the house. The family home, where she and Ahmed had spent decades, the place filled with so many memories, was no longer theirs. And he had done it without consulting her, without any consideration for their feelings. Tears welled in Mariam's eyes as she crumpled the letter in her hands. She had given everything for her son, sacrificed her youth and her dreams to ensure he had the best life possible. And now, this was how he repaid her? She had raised him with love and care, and this was the result. As she sat there, the weight of the betrayal sinking in, Mariam's heart hardened. The life she had known was slipping away. She had been taken for granted, her love and care dismissed as nothing more than a given. The realization that Imran no longer cared about her was more than just a personal heartbreak. It was a sign of the world's cruelty. And as she sat there, clutching the crumpled letter, a cold resolve began to form within her. She would not let this betrayal go unpunished. She would make sure that everyone who had wronged her would feel the consequences of their actions. The sweet, gentle woman they thought they knew, her family, her neighbors, even Imran, would be no more. The quiet, gentle Mariam would give way to something far darker. She would find her revenge, and it would be a lesson to all who had forgotten her. The days following the arrival of Imran's letter were a blur. Mariam couldn't focus on anything. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of betrayal and abandonment. She moved mechanically through her daily routine, tending to her husband, preparing meals, and attending to the small chores of the house. But in the quiet moments, when she had time to herself, the hurt and anger inside her boiled to the surface. Her heart ached as she stared at the empty chair where Ahmed used to sit, the place where they once shared their dreams and hopes for the future. Now, it seemed like all their dreams had been shattered, lost in the cold, indifferent world outside. It was late one evening, after another long day of caring for Ahmed, when Mariam finally found herself standing in the garden, gazing up at the moon. The garden, once a source of joy, now felt like a prison. The flowers she had so lovingly tended to over the years seemed to mock her, beautiful but fleeting. Like everything in her life, they were here one moment and gone the next. But it was in the silence of that night, under the cold, watchful eye of the moon, that something shifted inside her. She had spent so many years giving to her son, giving to her husband, giving to the world around her, and all she had received in return was neglect and heartache. No one had ever truly cared for her the way she had cared for them. The thought of Imran's letter, the final blow that severed the last tie to her son, lingered in her mind. The sale of the family property, the cold, impersonal tone, and the realization that, despite everything, he had never seen her as more than a burden. Mariam's fingers clenched into fists as a wave of fury surged through her. Her heart was broken, but her anger was fiercer than any sorrow. For the first time in years, Mariam felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: rage. Imran had chosen his own path, abandoned her and his father for the sake of his own comfort. He had sold the family home, the place that held all of their memories, without a second thought. But the more Mariam thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't just Imran's betrayal that had hurt her. It was the way everyone had used her. She had been the caretaker, the dutiful wife and mother, but when it came time for her to need something, to ask for help, no one had been there. Her son had disappeared into his new life, her neighbors had grown indifferent to her, and even her husband, despite his love, could no longer provide the support she so desperately needed. Mariam had given everything for them, and now she was left with nothing. And then, as if a fog lifted, an idea began to take shape in her mind. A dark, dangerous idea. The next morning, Mariam woke up with a sense of purpose she had not felt in years. As she moved through her usual morning routine, she began to notice things differently. The small, inconsequential details, the way the sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, the quiet hum of the village in the early hours, felt distant, almost irrelevant. Her focus had shifted entirely. She was no longer just a sweet, fragile old woman. She was someone who had been wronged, someone who was going to make things right. She made breakfast for Ahmed, but her mind was elsewhere. She no longer saw herself as the woman who had spent decades caring for her family, nurturing them, protecting them. She was someone else now. someone who had been pushed too far and who was ready to fight back. Her first target was obvious: Imran. She had raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him, and he had sold her out without a second thought. But she knew that confronting him directly would be useless.
He wouldn't listen.
He had already made his decision, and she couldn't change that. But there were other ways. Ways that didn't require confrontation, but that would hit him where it hurt the most. A few days later, Mariam made her way to the town square. It was a quiet afternoon, and most of the villagers were going about their business. She walked slowly, the weight of her plans settling over her like a heavy cloak. The first part of her revenge was simple. She would make sure Imran's new life in the city wasn't as easy as he thought it would be. She had kept in touch with a few of the villagers over the years, people who were once her friends, but who had now become mere acquaintances. One of these was Tariq, the village accountant. Tariq was a quiet man, reliable and trustworthy. Or at least he had been. Mariam had always kept a close eye on him, aware of his business dealings. Now, she had a different use for his services. Mariam. Tariq greeted her with a warm smile when he saw her approaching his small office. "It's good to see you. How's Ahmed?" "Ahmed is fine," Mariam replied, her voice cool and measured. "I need a favor." Tariq raised an eyebrow, sensing something was different in her demeanor. "Anything, Mariam. You know that." "I need to know some things about a certain property in the city," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The one Imran sold." Tariq hesitated for a moment, clearly sensing the tension in the air, but Mariam's gaze was steady, unwavering. He nodded, slowly. "I can get you that information, but I must warn you, it could take a while," he said cautiously. "It's a complicated process." Mariam smiled, her heart cold with determination. "I'm not in a hurry, but when you have the information, I'll know." As she left his office, a quiet satisfaction washed over her. Tariq would gather what she needed, details about the property, its sale, its value, and most importantly, the people involved. With this information, Mariam would begin to chip away at the life Imran had so casually built for himself. Days passed, and as Mariam waited, she began to implement her plan, slowly but surely. She knew that the key to revenge was patience. Her son would feel the effects of his betrayal, but she would make sure it was subtle, calculated. He would not know what was coming until it was too late. The quiet woman in the village, the one everyone had ignored and underestimated, was no more. Mariam's revenge was taking shape, and it would be as precise and unforgiving as the years of pain she had endured. But Mariam wasn't done yet. She had learned one thing from all of this. Revenge wasn't just about hurting others. It was about making them see the world as she had come to see it, cold, indifferent, and unforgiving. The days grew colder as winter began to settle over the village. The ground was hard with frost, and the once vibrant colors of Mariam's garden were now muted by the chill in the air. The sharpness of the wind matched the sharpness in Mariam's heart. She had felt a shift in herself ever since Imran's betrayal. What had once been a tender, giving spirit had been replaced by a cold determination that kept her awake at night. Mariam had spent the last few weeks quietly preparing her plan. She wasn't in a rush. There was no need for haste. Revenge, she had realized, was best served slow, like a simmering pot that would eventually bubble over and spill. With the information Tariq had provided, Mariam now knew everything she needed to know about the property Imran had sold. She knew the buyer, a wealthy businessman from the city, and the price he had paid, far more than the house was worth. She knew the dates, the details of the transaction, and even the connections the buyer had with other powerful figures in the region. These were all pieces of a puzzle that Mariam was beginning to assemble, one small piece at a time. But it wasn't just about the property. No, it was about making Imran understand the depth of his betrayal. She wanted him to feel what she felt when she read that letter, to understand that his actions had consequences far greater than he could ever imagine. Mariam sat at the kitchen table, the flickering light of the candle casting shadows on the walls around her. In front of her lay a small stack of letters she had written in the dead of night. They were addressed to Imran's business partners, people who had never met her, people who only knew her son as a successful businessman in the city. She wrote of the sale of the property, of the way her son had betrayed her and Ahmed. She wrote of how she had been left with nothing, how she had been cast aside like an old, broken doll. Each letter was carefully crafted. Mariam knew exactly what to say to make sure her words carried weight. She knew the right words to plant the seeds of doubt, to stir the pot just enough to make Imran's world start to unravel. It was on one of those quiet mornings, as the frost on the windows began to melt under the first rays of sunlight, that Mariam decided to send her letters. Tark had been helpful, providing her with the addresses and contacts she needed. She had learned that the businessman who had purchased the property was planning to develop the land into a luxury resort. This was her chance to hit him where it would hurt the most, in his wallet. Mariam carefully sealed the envelopes, her hands steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She knew she couldn't control how the letters would be received, but she didn't need to. She only needed to plant the seeds of doubt and let them grow on their own. As she walked to the post office, her mind was clear. She had already made her decision. She wasn't going to be the quiet, invisible woman any longer. She had been silent for too long, always sacrificing her own needs for the sake of others. But no more. Now, Mariam was going to make sure people saw her, and they would remember her. She dropped the letters into the mailbox, watching as they disappeared behind the metal slot. A feeling of satisfaction washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by something darker, something she couldn't quite name. The air around her seemed to change, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for what was to come next. For the next few days, Mariam observed the village, watching how life continued as usual. She wasn't the only one who had been wronged in the world, after all. She wasn't the only one who had been betrayed. There were others, people she had known for years, who had their own stories of hardship, of loss, of feeling abandoned by the world around them. Mariam knew that the village, though small, was full of secrets, full of people who had been overlooked and forgotten. One such person was Yasmin, an elderly woman who lived just down the street. Yasmin had been widowed years ago, and her children had long since moved away, leaving her alone. Mariam had often seen her sitting by her window, staring out at the world with a quiet, wistful look in her eyes. Yasmin was kind-hearted, but there was something sad in her gaze, something that spoke of years of isolation. It was on a chilly afternoon that Mariam visited Yasmin. She had already made up her mind. She was going to need help, allies, people who understood what it felt like to be left behind, to be forgotten. She needed people who would help her bring down those who had taken everything from her. "Yasmin, my dear," Mariam greeted her as she entered the small cottage. "How are you today?" Yasmin looked up from her knitting, a small, sad smile spreading across her face. "Oh, Mariam, it's good to see you. I'm all right, just getting old. You know how it is." Mariam sat beside her, the weight of her plan pressing down on her chest. "Yes, I do know. But sometimes, it feels like the world forgets us, doesn't it? Like we're just left behind." Yasmin nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "It's true, Mariam. People get so busy with their own lives, they forget the ones who took care of them when they were young." Mariam's voice dropped to a whisper. "You know, Yasmin, I've been thinking about the way people treat us, about how they forget us when they think we no longer matter. I've been thinking about revenge." Yasmin's eyes widened, and Mariam could see the flicker of something in her expression, recognition, maybe, or perhaps a spark of something darker. "Revenge?" Yasmin echoed softly. "What do you mean?" Mariam leaned closer, her voice low and dangerous. "I mean, Yasmin, that we don't have to let people walk all over us. We can make them pay. We can make them feel what it's like to be abandoned, to be left behind." For a moment, Yasmin was silent. Mariam could almost see the wheels turning in her head, the understanding dawning on her. Yasmin had been waiting for someone to show her the way, to give her a reason to fight back against the injustice she had faced all these years. Finally, Yasmin spoke, her voice steady and sure. "I'm with you, Mariam. What do we do?" Mariam smiled. She had just gained her first ally, and the path ahead became a little clearer. Yasmin would help her, and together, they would make sure that no one, not Imran, not the businessman from the city, would ever forget the pain they had caused. The seeds of Mariam's revenge were now planted, and she was no longer alone. She had allies, and together, they would create a storm that no one could weather. The days seemed to pass faster now, as if the world itself were urging Mariam onward. She could feel the weight of her plan gathering momentum, like a storm building on the horizon, its dark clouds slowly rolling toward the unsuspecting village. No longer was she just the quiet, elderly woman who baked cookies and knitted sweaters. Mariam had become a woman of purpose, a woman whose every action had meaning, whose every word was carefully chosen. Her alliance with Yasmin had proven to be the first of many steps in her larger scheme. Yasmin, though initially hesitant, had become a devoted accomplice. Her loneliness and bitterness over the years had given her a deep well of resentment, one that Mariam had skillfully tapped into. Together, they had begun gathering information about the people who had wronged them. Yasmin's sharp memory and network of old acquaintances had provided invaluable insights into the dealings of those in the village, while Mariam's keen sense of strategy had helped turn that information into leverage. But Mariam knew that the small village would not be enough to exact the revenge she so desperately craved. She needed to reach beyond its borders, to the city where Imran and his new life now thrived. She needed to make him feel the consequences of his actions in a way that he could not ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows over the village, Mariam sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, a glass of water in front of her. She had been thinking about the next phase of her plan, something that would be more than just subtle hints and whispered words. She needed something that would shake Imran to his core, something that would unravel the life he had so carelessly built. Her mind raced, flipping through the many possibilities. She thought of confronting him, but that would give him the chance to defend himself. No, that would be too easy. Imran deserved something far worse than a mere confrontation. He deserved to feel powerless, to feel the way she had felt when she had been discarded like old furniture. He had turned his back on her, and now it was time for him to understand just how deep the consequences of his actions would run. That's when it came to her. She would strike at his finances. Imran had always prided himself on his business acumen, always boasting about his success in the city. But what if that success was nothing more than an illusion? What if the deals he had made were built on shaky foundations, built on the backs of those who had been too naive or too trusting? Mariam's mind raced as she began to form a plan that would infiltrate Imran's business dealings without him even knowing it. She would use the letters she had sent to his partners as the opening move. Those letters had been small sparks in a dry field. The next steps would fan those sparks into a blaze. Mariam's first move was to track down the wealthy businessman who had purchased the family property. His name was Asad Malik, and he was as ruthless as he was rich. Asad had built his fortune in real estate, and he was known for buying properties for a fraction of their worth and turning them into luxurious developments. It was said that he had no regard for the people whose lives he disrupted in the process. Yasmin had provided Mariam with the name of Asad's secretary, someone who knew the ins and outs of his business dealings, someone who could be of use to her. Mariam had a way with words, and she knew that a few carefully chosen lines could open doors that would otherwise remain closed. A week later, Mariam stood at the entrance of a sleek office building in the city. She had dressed carefully, wearing her best coat and a scarf that framed her face just so. She had chosen this look not just for its elegance, but for its simplicity. No one would suspect the quiet, elderly woman in front of them of being capable of anything other than what she appeared to be: weak, frail, and invisible. She walked into the lobby, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, and approached the receptionist. "I have an appointment with Mr. Malik's secretary," Mariam said, her voice smooth and confident. The receptionist, a young woman with wide eyes, glanced at her computer screen before nodding. "Right this way, Mrs. Mariam," she said simply, offering a warm smile. "Just Mariam." The The receptionist led her to a small office at the back of the building, where a young woman sat behind a desk, typing furiously on her computer. The woman looked up, clearly surprised to see an elderly woman standing in front of her, but quickly recovered, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Mrs. Mariam," the secretary said, her voice polite but curt. "How can I help you today?" "I'm here on a matter of some importance," Mariam replied, her eyes glinting with something that made the secretary hesitate. "It's regarding the recent property deal between Mr. Malik and my son, Imran." The secretary's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Imran's name, but she didn't interrupt. "I'm sure Mr. Malik would appreciate hearing about some irregularities in the way the deal was conducted," Mariam continued, her voice low, her words dripping with calculated intent. "You see, I've come to believe that there were things about the transaction that were not entirely above board." The secretary's fingers paused over the keyboard, and she looked up at Mariam with a newfound interest. "What sort of irregularities?" Mariam smiled. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person with Mr. Malik. I'm sure he would be very interested in hearing what I have to say." It took only an hour for Mariam to secure an appointment with Asad Malik himself. She had used the right words, the right tone, and now the doors were opening wide. The secretary had been hesitant at first, but Mariam's calm authority and subtle threat had made her reconsider. Asad Malik was exactly what Mariam had expected, smooth, polished, and arrogant. He met her in his luxurious office, sitting behind a massive desk made of dark mahogany. His eyes were sharp, assessing, as if he could see through her thin, frail exterior. But Mariam was not intimidated. She had faced much worse in her life, and she had learned how to hide her true self behind the mask of age. "Mariam," Asad greeted her, leaning forward in his chair, his fingers steepled. "I understand you have some concerns about the deal involving my recent purchase of your family's property." "I do," Mariam said, her voice cold. "I believe there were certain details that were overlooked. Details that could be very damaging to your reputation." Asad leaned back in his chair, his smile never wavering. "I'm sure you're mistaken, but I'll listen to what you have to say. Go ahead." And so Mariam began. She told him everything, about the letters she had sent, about the potential legal complications, about the corruption she had discovered in the paperwork. She didn't lie, but she didn't tell him everything either. She painted a picture of a deal that was shady at best, and Asad could sense that there was more to the story than he was being told. Before she left, she dropped the final seed, one final piece of information that would keep Asad Malik awake at night, wondering if Mariam knew more than she let on. "Consider this a warning, Mr. Malik," she said, her voice steady. "I'm a woman who has lost everything, and I have nothing left to lose. If you don't handle this matter properly, you may find your reputation and your wealth slipping through your fingers." Mariam had always believed that the first blow in any battle should be subtle. It should land quietly, almost unnoticed, like a small crack in a glass. At first, no one would see it for what it was, but over time, that crack would spread, weakening the entire structure until it could no longer stand. Her first strike was no different. She had spent weeks laying the groundwork, reaching out to old allies, forging new ones, and carefully orchestrating a series of moves that would seem harmless at first glance, but which would reverberate through the power structure she was targeting. It was a game of chess, and Mariam had become a master strategist. Every move had to be calculated, precise. The goal was simple: undermine, expose, and make them feel the consequences of their actions. The first part of her plan involved a small but significant action, disrupting the land deal between Asad Malik and several key investors who had been involved in purchasing properties around the village. The land was ripe for development, and the money involved was vast. This was the sort of deal that could make or break careers, and Mariam knew that breaking it would send shockwaves through Malik's entire operation. One cold morning, Mariam stood at the edge of the village, staring out at the land that had once been her family's. The property, which Malik had purchased for a fraction of its value, was now a prime location for his luxury resort. The plans were already in motion. Construction would begin soon. Mariam could almost feel the pulse of the land beneath her feet, the memories of her life there rushing back. But these weren't the thoughts that consumed her now. What mattered now was what she could do to stop the deal before it went through. Yasmin had been busy working the network, gathering information on the developers involved in the project. One of them was a man named Farhan, a real estate mogul known for his ruthlessness. He had played a pivotal role in securing the deal with Malik. A man like him, focused solely on profit, was bound to have skeletons in his closet. Mariam had been watching him closely for days. She had learned where he ate, where he lived, and most importantly, where his weaknesses lay. It didn't take long for her to find out about a small but crucial discrepancy in Farhan's business dealings, an under-the-table transaction involving a construction company that had been caught using subpar materials in its previous projects. If word got out about this, it could ruin Farhan's reputation and his career. Mariam, ever the opportunist, saw her chance. She sent an anonymous letter to the local newspaper, detailing the illegal activities and shady dealings surrounding Farhan's construction company. The letter was written in careful, deliberate language, ensuring that it couldn't be traced back to her. Within hours, the story was picked up by the press, and soon, Farhan's name was splashed across the front pages. The scandal caused an uproar. The next day, as the headlines screamed of Farhan's involvement in a corruption scandal, Mariam watched from her window as the first tremors of the storm she had set in motion began to ripple through the village. Farhan, caught off guard, immediately called for a press conference, trying desperately to salvage his reputation. His ties to Malik were suddenly under scrutiny. Investors began to pull out of the deal, hesitant to be associated with a man whose name was now tainted. Mariam knew that this was just the beginning. Farhan's downfall had only made the situation more volatile for Asad Malik. The cracks were starting to appear, and Mariam had already set her sights on the next phase of her plan. While the media frenzy over Farhan's scandal raged on, Mariam turned her attention to Imran. She hadn't forgotten the letter he had sent, the one that had severed their bond. But now, she understood the full scope of his betrayal. He hadn't just sold the family property. He had sold his own mother's legacy, her memories, and her love, all for the sake of profit. She needed to hurt him, but not in the way one might expect. Confrontation would be too easy. No, Mariam had another idea. She would make Imran feel the same helplessness, the same sense of loss that she had felt when she read that cold letter. Mariam's plan was deceptively simple. She would hit him where it hurt the most, his ego. She would use the very thing that had made him so arrogant in the first place, his business success. Mariam had learned that Imran's latest project, an upscale restaurant in the city, was on the verge of opening. The restaurant was going to be his big debut, his claim to fame. It was supposed to be the first in a series of high-end establishments he was planning to open. It was, in his eyes, the culmination of all his hard work, the symbol of his success. But success, Mariam knew, was often built on a shaky foundation. And if you knew where to strike, even the most successful businesses could come crashing down. She had made sure that the suppliers for the restaurant, those who were providing the food, the ingredients, the furniture, had no idea that their shipments were being tampered with. Using a contact from the village who had a cousin working in the supply chain, Mariam ensured that the quality of the goods being delivered was subpar. The restaurant would receive shipments of expired, spoiled, or improperly handled ingredients. When the opening night came, the grand reveal of Imran's dream would turn into a disaster. Opening night arrived, and Mariam could hardly contain her satisfaction as she sat in the corner of a quiet cafe, watching the chaos unfold through the city's social media feeds. Imran's restaurant was packed with guests, eager to sample the food and experience the luxury he had promised. But as the night wore on, things began to go wrong. The food arrived late, the wine was served at the wrong temperature, and several dishes were inedible. One by one, customers began posting negative reviews online, complaining about the quality of the food and the disorganization of the event. Imran's staff struggled to keep up with the demand, and the stress was palpable. By the end of the night, the reviews were already piling in, harsh, unforgiving words that cut deep into Imran's reputation. Mariam smiled to herself as she read the first of the reviews. Worst restaurant experience ever. The food was awful, And the service was worse. Don't waste your money. It didn't take long for the word to spread. The following day, social media was ablaze with complaints. Imran's dream, his pride, was crumbling. The opening night disaster would haunt him for months, if not years. The damage had been done, and no amount of advertising or public relations could undo it. Mariam's first strike had been successful. She had planted the seeds of destruction, and they were already beginning to bear fruit. Farhan's scandal had tarnished Asad Malik's empire, and Imran's restaurant had suffered a devastating blow. The cracks that Mariam had carefully created were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before they tore everything apart. But this was only the beginning. Mariam's vengeance had just begun to take root. With every calculated move, she was pulling tighter on the strings of the web she had woven, and she knew that soon, those who had wronged her would realize that they had underestimated her. The city had a way of swallowing people whole, making them forget who they were, where they came from. The towering skyscrapers, the neon lights, the constant hum of activity, it all blurred together into an impersonal world where the powerful thrived and the powerless were left to fade into obscurity. Mariam had always felt like a small fish in a vast ocean, but now, as she navigated through the cold streets, she felt more like a predator than prey. She had learned the rules of survival the hard way. Patience, subtlety, and a sharp mind could bend the world to her will. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her more dangerous than anything. Back in the village, her work had started to bear fruit. Her alliance with Yasmin had proved invaluable. Yasmin had quietly spread the word about Mariam's new determination, and people were beginning to talk. There were whispers of a woman who had been overlooked for far too long, a woman who had been mistreated and discarded. Those who had long since forgotten Mariam were starting to feel the first tremors of her revenge. But as her network grew, so did her understanding of the people she was up against. Imran, the son who had betrayed her, was only one piece of a larger puzzle. She realized that to truly make them all feel her wrath, she needed more than just personal vendettas. She needed to bring down the systems that allowed people like Asad Malik to thrive, to show the world that no one was untouchable, not even those who thought they were above reproach. Mariam's latest move had been to gather information about Asad Malik's associates, those who worked in the shadows, pulling the strings behind his empire. She had learned that there were people even more dangerous than Malik himself, men and women who had built their wealth by preying on the vulnerable, exploiting the very system that had abandoned Mariam and her family. But to reach them, Mariam would need more than just secrets. She needed leverage, and that's where Yasmin came in. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Mariam and Yasmin met in the small, dimly lit kitchen of Mariam's cottage. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls as the two women sat in silence for a moment, their thoughts heavy with the weight of what was to come. "I've been talking to some of the old villagers," Yasmin said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, but full of meaning. "The ones who still remember us before all of this, before the betrayal. There's talk of some important figures in the village, businessmen, officials, even a few of the local landowners. They're all tied to Malik in one way or another." Mariam listened intently, her hands folded in her lap. "What do they want, Yasmin? What are they looking for?" "They want power," Yasmin replied, her voice bitter. "Money, influence. They've all been part of the same game for years, taking from the people and giving nothing back. They feed off the weakness of the poor and the vulnerable. I've seen it with my own eyes, Mariam. These people, they've ruined so many lives." Mariam's eyes narrowed. She could feel the cold resolve deepening within her. "We need to expose them. Make them see the consequences of their greed." Yasmin nodded, her expression dark. "We can't do it alone, though. We'll need more than just words. We need to take action." Mariam's plan was taking shape more clearly now. The first step was to create alliances with others who had been wronged, others who had been left behind by the powerful forces that controlled the village and the city. There were whispers of a local merchant who had lost everything due to Malik's manipulations, a farmer who had been driven out of business by a corrupt land deal, and a teacher whose school had been closed down because of pressure from wealthy landowners. Mariam sent out feelers, reaching out to those she knew could be useful. She wasn't interested in making friends. She was interested in making connections, forging alliances that would help her bring down the empire of greed that had cast her aside. One by one, these people began to come forward, sharing their stories, their losses, and their frustrations. Mariam listened, carefully piecing together the larger picture. The more she learned, the more she realized just how deep the corruption ran. But she also knew that this was her chance to strike at the heart of it. She reached out to a few trusted individuals within the network, gathering information on the key players who were involved with Malik's dealings. Among them was an influential woman named Zainab, a former partner of Malik's who had fallen out of favor after refusing to bend to his demands. Zainab had gone underground, but she was still a powerful figure in the world of business, with contacts that stretched far beyond the city. Mariam met Zainab in a quiet, nondescript cafe, away from the prying eyes of the city's elite. Zainab was a woman of striking presence, her dark eyes sharp and calculating, her posture unyielding. She looked at Mariam with a mix of curiosity and caution. "You've been making waves, Mariam," Zainab said, taking a sip of her coffee. "People are talking about you, about how you've managed to get under Malik's skin." "I don't want to just get under his skin," Mariam replied, her voice low but steady. "I want to destroy everything he's built." Zainab raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "And how do you plan on doing that?" "I have information," Mariam said, leaning forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know how his deals are made. I know how he manipulates people to get what he wants. But I also know the people who've been hurt by him, the ones who've been left behind. And I can use that. I can expose him, ruin him, make him pay for everything he's done." Zainab considered this for a moment, her gaze never leaving Mariam's face. "You're not the first person to try and take him down. But you're different, aren't you? You've got something that most of these people don't." Mariam met her eyes, her expression unwavering. "I have nothing left to lose." Zainab smiled, the coldness in her eyes matching Mariam's. "I think we can work together. But this won't be easy. We'll need to be smart, patient, and most importantly, we'll need to keep our enemies closer than ever." Over the next few weeks, Mariam and Zainab began to strategize. The network of people who had come forward grew larger, and with each new ally, the sense of urgency and purpose grew stronger. Mariam knew that she was no longer just avenging herself. She was dismantling an entire system of corruption, a system that had been built on the backs of the vulnerable and the forgotten. But as the plan unfolded, Mariam also realized something else. As she drew closer to her goal, she had to be careful. She had to be more than just a woman seeking revenge. She had to become a shadow in the night, an unstoppable force that no one could see coming. Her next move would be crucial. It would be the moment when the scales tipped and the game of power she had been playing finally came to a head.